Gary Gulman's latest comedy special, The Great Depresh, takes on the issue of depression. I'm heading over here from Gold Derby to ask you, Gary, um, comedy special on depression, was that, like in just your mind, a marriage made in heaven?
That's interesting. I will say that I'm not the first person to, obviously, first comedian to talk about depression explicitly and in detail, but I think that, and that was a reason why I was reluctant at first to cover it. I thought, well, a lot of people have talked about this, but I think I may be the first one to talk about having electroconvulsive therapy and the extensive hospital stays. And so I think the challenge was to make that funny and also to destigmatize the entire process and the treatment, as well as just the condition. So I was aiming high, and I knew it would be a challenge, but my feeling after I've been doing comedy for 26 years is there's usually a good reward when you take a big risk. So that's what sort of motivated it.
Yeah, and I guess something also, like you talked about in the special, how that was such a something you were very scared about addressing, because comedy is usually tapping into the relatable, and you were talking about something that a lot of people couldn't relate to, and we see you take that to a comedy club for the first time, and then we see you deliver most of the set in the special sort of more polished sort of setting. How was it like to evolve and work on that particular bit, a bit that you had a lot of anxiety about starting?
Right. The thing was that I had anxiety before I started to talk about it on stage. But what was interesting was that my anxiety had nothing to do with, initially, it had nothing to do with telling jokes about depression. I was just very sick. And it sort of became a necessity to address how I looked, how I was moving, because there was clearly something off about me. I was shaking, and I was really in a bad way. So I've always found that the easiest way to address things is through some humor and some jokes. And then it gave me license to talk about the other things that I wanted to talk about. But very early on, when I started to talk about depression and anxiety and treatments and medicines, I found that the audience, when I did my meet and greets or when I just mingled after the show, they were very grateful, and they were saying that either they had experienced it, or a friend or family member, a loved one, had experienced depression and anxiety and illness, and they were so grateful, and so then it became very easy to talk about it, because there was such a really sweet reward to doing the shows and talking about that.
Yeah, and you even sort of touch on at the end of the special that idea of how you're not alone, and how it's important when you have depression to know that you're not alone, even though it sort of, the condition makes you feel more alone and perhaps isolates you more, at least internally in your head. How does that go in sort of the context as a stand-up comedian, where you are literally standing up on your own?
That's It's interesting, because I'm standing alone, but I'm also standing on, and this is such a cliche now, but I think it's accurate, standing on the shoulders of giants of comedy who've been honest about their weaknesses, and who've talked about their neuroses, and been honest about things they don't like about themselves, things they're embarrassed about. So I had that. I had models and mentors who had talked about this. Maria Bamford talked about being in the hospital. So I wasn't really doing anything that had been rejected by audiences in the past. So that was helpful. And then, like I said, after the shows, when I would do the meet and greets, so many people, there were people in tears, there were people hugging me who were saying that it made them feel seen and it made them feel less alone. And it is ironic that I'm telling this by myself, but there's also a large audience of people who are giving me instant feedback that they are enjoying this and interested in this, and also that it's not so, it's broken up pretty regularly with jokes and lightness. So that was part of the saving grace, that there was a spoonful of sugar with all this medicine.
Yeah. And I think when you're talking with Robert in the special, you sort of talk about this idea that contentment, this myth that contentment is the enemy of funny. If we were to flip that sort of idea, is comedy like, can that help you find contentment or deal with things like depression? Has that been a helpful thing in that you've been able to laugh at yourself and laugh at the situation? Or has it, been harmful in that it focuses you in on yourself and the things you're finding hard?
Right. No, that's a great question, because I hadn't thought of the other side of that, which is, and I have been thinking about that, because at a very early age, I noticed that when I was laughing at a comedian, or when I was getting laughter from my family or from my friends, I was at least distracted from my negative, pessimistic ruminations and my fears and my anxieties. But also there seemed to be, and doctors have discussed this and talked about this, there seems to be some sort of chemical release when you're connecting with people, especially in that way, through humor. And so I think there's an antidepressant effect to humor. But also the great thing with comedy is that you're usually on shows with other comedians. You're one, getting out of the house, two, spending time with other people who you can be honest with. Comedians, for whatever reason, are very open about their depression, their anxiety, and their fears and cynicism and pessimism. So you feel like you can open up to them. And so I think that the other side of that, like you asked, is that the entire environment of comedy and the act itself has antidepressant qualities to it.
Yeah, like I'm not a comedian, and I haven't had depression, but I do know when I'm feeling down that sort of being able to see the funny side of things helps me not take everything so seriously. And it's such
Yeah.
yeah.
And also, when you hear a comedian sort of be dismissive or belittle certain aspects of their lives that you think are horrific, it gives you courage to say, well, it's not that bad. This guy is laughing about it. This guy is mocking his hospitalization. He's mocking his treatment, and maybe I can get through this too, and see a funny side in the it's just the unfairness of it all is so absurd that I think that the healthiest thing to do is to laugh at it and jeer at it.
Yeah, and that I guess big role of comedy is making fun of the unfair and the absurd and the irrational and all that sort of stuff. What do you think, Gary, the funniest thing is about depression?
I think the funniest thing about depression and this, I mean, one of the sad things is you can't really see it from the other side of it, but it takes, I'm a very large man. I'm 6'6", around 220 pounds, and I can race up and down the street. I run, but when I was sick, I couldn't keep pace with my wife, who's a foot shorter and not a college athlete. She would lap me. She would be ahead of me by a block because I was just shuffling down the street, and it turned me into a man with the physicality 50 years older than myself. And it was hard to get out of bed to walk my dogs, and just these things that seem so simple now were like climbing mountains. I would have to psych myself up to go for short walks to get coffee. It was just, it's comical now, but at the time it felt like that this sort of mask and costume had been draped over me that made me feel unattractive and lazy and dumb and slow, and it's comical outside of it, but within it just feels like reality.
Yeah. I'm also a millennial, so thank you very much, Gary,
Oh,
for
yeah.
your compliments in the special. The interesting thing though is, even though like I think the millennial sort of generation has grown up being more um, uh, accepting of sensitive boys, um,
Yeah.
we still see depression rates quite high amongst our generation and the generation below us. Any thoughts as to why maybe that is? Like,
I think there are a couple of things going on. Is that I think there's more sensitivity, and when there's sensitivity, there's a lot of times there's pain, especially with the unfairness. You are inheriting a world that we've wrecked environmentally, and you're facing debt, which financial insecurity is so depressing and can be so overwhelming. And I also think that, and this is potentially a good thing, that you're more likely to come forward and say there's something wrong. I shouldn't be feeling like this. And I think when I was growing up, I thought my idea of how to feel better was to achieve great things, and then I would feel good about myself. And I think millennials, and I mean, this is just a theory, that millennials are aware that there's more to life than great achievement and financial success. There's community, and there's also an inner peace that I think that they're more aware of. I mean, I think my assessment of the millennial culture has borne out in the protests that we're seeing, and the reaction to the injustices and the unfairness. So I'm really in awe and admire your generation. And I also am ashamed, because we should have been doing this work so that it wasn't all on you. It shouldn't have been required at this point. We should have been doing all this work all the time. So it's shameful, really.
yeah, apology accepted. No, I'm joking. Um, so, Gary, what is your favorite? What bit do you think is the funniest in the special? What's the bit that sort of lands that you get just a kick out of each time?
I really, one joke that I'm really proud of is, because it was hard to just admit that I had been in the hospital, because I know personally, whenever I was told somebody had been hospitalized with mental illness, I had such pity, and I felt so bad for them, and I was worried for them. And so when I went on stage one night and said, one, that I'd been in the mental hospital, but the way I said it was, I said, who here has been recognized in the psych ward? Knowing that nobody would raise their hand, one, because they didn't want to admit that they were in the psych ward, and two, they probably hadn't been in the psych ward. So I talked about being recognized by a patient in the psych ward, and the laugh, as you probably know from comedians, we're addicted to getting laughs. So if, no matter how wild it seemed to me before I said it, to admit that, once the laughter came, and it came in a major way, I couldn't wait to say that again. And so I mean, it was a blessing that the audiences were reacting that positively to it. So that was my favorite, because I hadn't done a lot of comedy up to this time that you could say took any great courage or bravery. And in the long run, I don't think it was. I think the really brave thing is getting through the illness and getting up every day and working through it. I think talking about it from the other side is almost, I almost feel obligated to share my story in a sort of, and I'm exaggerating the depth of it, but just kind of as to tell my odyssey. I mean, I didn't have to fight Cyclops and other mythical monsters, but I did have to go through a gauntlet of my own, and I almost feel that an obligation to share that with people, especially people who are suffering, so that they know that there's hope. I found so much solace over the years by hearing about people who suffered and overcame it, and it gave me hope and a reason not to give up.
Yeah, and I think from talking or for listening to some of my friends who have had depression, something that I think is something that they've found helpful learning is that it's the strength in vulnerability. And it's
Yes.
sort of, it seems like that when they're in that mindset, it's sort of really a myth that there is no strength in vulnerability and that you've got to keep it all to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Jewish man, but I'm an admirer of Jesus, and he said my strength is made perfect in my weakness, or something to that effect. And I think that kind of vulnerability and being open about it is a real strength.
Yeah, no, I'm a churchgoer, and
Okay.
Paul writes a bit about weakness in strength as well, and sort of when
Yes.
I am weak,
So,
you're strong. Yeah,
right. So maybe I'm quoting Paul speaking of
could be
Jesus.
Paul, could be you know, who knows?
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite verses though. What you talked about in the special about how you're so glad you stuck around because some of the things you've got to experience and see. What are you most grateful from being able to have seen or experienced?
Well, I guess I there are so many just simple things, but just some of the emails I've gotten from people who say, I watched your special and I went to a therapist. I watched your special during the lowest time in my life and it gave me hope. I watched your special and I just finished my 10th treatment of ECT. I watched my special with my parents and they finally understand my depression, my anxiety. I showed this to my husband and he has a new understanding. So those are things that are just so moving and touching, and also make me think like that I've served some sort of purpose, that this is doing good. And I mean there are fun things like getting a phone call from Jay Leno and Howie Mandel, and hearing that David Letterman loved the special, and that certain people who are well known have reached out, but more so the things that I think are just make me feel so grateful that I didn't succumb, and so many people do, are the people that it helped. There's that Talmudic story of if you save one person, you save the world. And I don't know that I've saved one person, but I've made certain people their journey a little lighter and made them feel less alone. And I've heard that again and again. And so that's probably the best thing. And I'm not being corny or that's really the greatest thing, and more than I could have expected. I remember thinking that if the show didn't get onto HBO, or if it wasn't seen as extensively as it has been seen, and I would have done a service just by doing it at live shows and theaters, and that I would help a few people feel less alone. But the fact that it got on HBO and that so many people have seen it in their living rooms, that has been a gift and a blessing that I'm so grateful for.
We've pretty much got to wrap up now, Gary. But did your mum get to see the special?
My mom?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Did she like
Of
it?
course.
Did she like it?
She absolutely loved it. Her only thing all along, and I know she was joking, but it made me laugh every time. She said, "Can you ask Judd Apatow to make me look thinner?" That was that was her big thing. But I take such pleasure in that scene we do, because it's sort of a representation of our relationship, where we laughed a lot together growing up, and it was really helpful to get through a lot of the tough times we experienced.
Oh, well, Gary, the special, the Great Depresh, it's literally a lifesaver, and a
Oh,
conversation
thank
that,
you.
a conversation, I mean that figuratively, literally, however you want to take it. Um, the it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. It's a good conversation to be having, and all the best of luck with the upcoming Emmy Awards.
So thank you so much, and same here, and thanks for including me in this. I really appreciate your time.
No, no worries at all. And people can go to goldderby.com and they can make their own award predictions and watch other contender interviews. Yeah.